This program is brought to you by Emory University.
On April 8, 2015, the Center for Faculty Development and Excellence at Emory University hosted Meet the Editor and Agent, an annual event that brings experts in publishing to campus. The featured speakers were Eric Zinner, Associate Director and Editor-in-Chief at New York University Press, and Sam Stoloff, Vice President and Senior Agent at the Francis Goldin Literary Agency in New York. In this video, Mr. Stoloff offers strategies for academic authors who want to write for the trade publishing market.
Trade publishing is about making money. And so I'm here to talk about that side and talk about, in particular, how academic authors can write for what's called trade publishing, the trade publishing side. I work with a lot of academic authors, and so I'm familiar with the dilemmas that are presented to academic authors when they're trying to write for the trade. And for academic authors, a lot of the issue is unlearning bad habits, what I think of as bad habits. And I come to this from academia, and so, of course, I have witnessed firsthand the pressures that are on you, on academic authors, to write in particular kinds of ways, but the kinds of ways that are not going to serve you very well when you're not talking to your peers, to your community, when you're trying to talk to people who are not specialists in your field. Because all of the pressures on you in your training and your professional development are in the opposite direction. And so the kinds of things, you know what I'm talking about, there's a certain kind of, and there are good reasons why you use that kind of language and write in that particular kind of style. It has its uses, rigorousness, scholarly caution, circumspection, the tendency, how we're talking about this, a tendency to hedge conclusions and causality, which is admirable in its way, of course. It's about a proper appreciation for what you can demonstrate. But on the trade side will not serve you well. These are habits that are going to prevent you from being able to speak to people who are not in your field. An impersonal voice, a reluctance to use the first person, to speak personally, authoritativeness. Not that there's not a place for authoritative writing for a general readership, there is, but I think it means you end up defended in a way that doesn't necessarily serve you well. An analytic mode. So these are some of the hurdles that I see you as facing. That is the kinds of writing habits that you have ingrained that you need to learn to overcome. I think of them as something you have to overcome. And the sad thing is that often you'll be publishing scholarly work until you get tenure. And once you get tenure, you're freed up in a certain way. But by then it's too late. The habits are already so ingrained that you'll never unlearn them. But it's possible. I'm here to tell you it's possible, and I'm here to encourage you. I assume that some of you are here because you're tempted to try, or you have ambitions in that direction. So for trade publishing, the thing that you most need to think about is audience. So when I get proposals very often from authors, they try to tell me who they think their book is for, or they fail to try at all, or when they try, they tell me that it's for a general reader. And I'm here to tell you there's really no such thing. you need to have a good sense, and I'm exaggerating, right? Of course there is a general reader, there's a general educated reader, um, but it's not that helpful to think of it in those terms because it means you're writing for everyone and no one. And when you're writing for general readers, and before that for the trade publishers who you hope will bring your work to those general readers, they're going to want to know who's going to buy your book. Who's the audience? Who's the readership? Who do we think we're going to sell this to? And depending what you're writing about, you need to think about who exactly it is you're writing for and to, who you're speaking to. And what's going to appeal to that readership. And you have to realize that for trade publishers, if you're publishing a book for a general readership, that you're trying to overcome a very high hurdle. That is another mistake that authors often make when they approach me, is to imagine that because their work is important, that therefore people will want to read it. It can be about a very important subject, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's going to want to read it, and certainly not buy a book about it. Buying a book is a very steep hurdle indeed. And especially because there is so much competition for people's attention. I get queries from journalists, and they pitch me stories, pitch me books, and very often, they're experienced at pitching magazine stories, but they don't quite get what it takes, not just to get somebody to read a magazine story. That's actually a fairly low hurdle. If people flip through magazines and read things quite easily, the barriers are not high. Buying a book, on the other hand, you're actually asking somebody to go seek out that book. Unlike a magazine where you stumble across things, you want people to come find the book. You hope that they hear about it through various ways, through reviews, through interviews on the radio, and so on. But that those things will motivate them. They then have to go seek out the book to go find it, and then have to be willing to actually plunk down $25 or whatever it is to buy it. That is a very high hurdle, much higher hurdle. And so the question is, what's going to motivate them? You have to motivate your potential reader. And very often what we're talking about then is an appeal to the emotions, to various kinds of emotions. The appeal to book buyers is an appeal to anxiety, perhaps. Let's say you're writing a book about a contagious disease. You're appealing to their anxiety about the terrible things that might happen. Desire for improvement, for self-improvement, very powerful emotion. Excitement, fascination, and desire for knowledge too. I don't mean to say that that's not also part of the equation, but in that case, if you're writing a book that is mostly meant to be informative, you need to be able to sort of amp up your claims. And this is, I think, the hardest thing for academic authors ultimately, is the willingness to allow a certain amount of, let's say, exaggeration in the packaging and presentation. Just in order to get attention. So, for instance, just a couple of examples that you will recognize, exaggerating for effect. So books of history that claim to be about the year that changed everything. Or the debate that defined America, or the fruit that changed the world, these kinds of things. You have to be, you have to tolerate that, because it is necessary in order to get readers' attention. So you have to be comfortable with popularization in that sense. I feel like, and this is what I often say, I said to Elena this morning, that there's, or I said to somebody, that I believe, I have to believe, because I'm interested in doing serious books and books that matter, books that are informative, that there's a happy medium, that you don't have to sacrifice academic rigor and accuracy in writing for a general audience. that you're presenting it in a different style, in a more approachable style. But you don't have to think of it as dumbing down necessarily. It can still be a really smart book. It just has to appeal through other channels, through emotional channels. And so here's a few specific sorts of ways to think about how to write in a way that will appeal to the emotions. Actually, chief among them, perhaps, is narrative. Is writing about actual people, actual situations. I think very often it's easy to lose sight of the power of stories. And that stories are how, when you're talking about something, when your interest is largely, let's say, analytic, and I was talking to a member of the faculty this morning, and she had written up a description of her project that was very analytic. And she mentions in passing a bunch of actual historical, real-world instances of the thing that she's analyzing, but she didn't actually tell any of the stories. And I said, well, you have to tell the stories. I sort of understand on an abstract level what you mean when you use this kind of analytical language, but because it's not my field, I don't really know what you're talking about. The way to communicate to me what you're talking about is by first telling the story and then doing the analytic work of explaining it. And then the analysis for me will be grounded in my understanding of the real world example. So very, very hard to overstate the power of narrative as a way of engaging a reader, but also as a teaching tool, right? Also, being present, and this is the thing that you and I were talking about, Elena, this morning, is about being present in your work, not being afraid to use I, to use the first person, to have the personal relationship to the material, even if only in a preface or an introduction, to talk about what brings you to it, why it matters to you. That as a way of modeling for the reader why it might matter for them, why they might care about it. And so, so the kinds of readers, the general readers that I'm saying is a mythical creature. So I'm still pretending that that's a real reader. So, so let's say they're like New Yorker readers. They're smart. They do want to be informed, but they don't want to work too hard at it. They want it to be a pleasure. So don't underestimate the power of pleasure. Pleasure is also highly motivating. So for that reader, they also want to be able to think that they're getting something that's comprehensive. For scholars, it's very much about staking out a sort of part of a problem, part of a field, and sort of debating with others in the field about the particular problem that's at issue. But for general readers, you have to forget that. They don't want a part of it. They want the whole thing. They want something comprehensive. They want something definitive. And so for some of you, maybe that's a book that you consider down the road, a book that you may feel more equipped to write later on in a career when you are moving from a smaller, more proscribed part of your field to making more sort of general pronouncements. But for the trade, it's important to be able to do.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.